Silverwing is being read with permission of HarperCollins Children's Books. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to read part 3 of our book Silverwing. So last time we heard about Tree Haven, and Shade met with the elders because he was in trouble for staying out when the sun came up. And he kind of found out a few things, that the bats were banished and punished and sent away. And we left off with Frida, the main elder, was getting ready to explain what that meant to Shade. We also learned that more about his father, and that his father had also wanted to see the sun like him. And we met a couple of the elders. Some were nice, some not so nice. But it seems that Shade and Frida have a little bit of a connection. They were meeting up while Shade was grounded for what he did. So let's get to the next chapter. Chapter 3, The Echo Chamber. Last dawn, Shade had traveled to the summit of Tree Haven, and now Frida was leading him to its very depths. They spiraled down the length of the great trunk, and Shade again marveled at the sheer size of the tree. Down and down until they landed on the mossy bottom. He was aware of how much cooler it was, and the strong smell of soil and wood. He thought he'd explored every winding inch of Tree Haven, every passageway and hollow, but he'd never noticed this small archway of gnarled wood, which Frida was scuttling toward on all fours. He followed her through and down, and instantly he knew he was beneath the earth. His echoes bounced harshly against the walls of the narrow passageway. "Here we are," said Frida up ahead. The floor of the tunnel fell away, and Shade gladly opened his wings and swooped down into a large cave. He felt the cold seeping through the stone walls and thought, winter. But then he heard the wind, or at least he thought it was the wind. But as he flared his ears, listened harder, he realized it was the voices he was hearing. Bat voices. So many of them, mumbling over one another like a ghostly breeze through the leaves. It made the flesh beneath his fur crawl. "Who's down there?" he asked, faltering. "Nobody," said Frida. "I'll show you." "There's voices." "You'll see. This way." Frida led him deeper still, down to the bottom of the cave, and then landed on a narrow ledge. In a small niche in the rough stone, Shade saw a panel of mud and mulched up leaves. The voices were coming from behind it. "Quickly now," Frida told him, and pushed through the soft center of the panel with her nose. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe a mournful chorus of ghosts, maybe only one with 1,000 weeping mouths. He found himself in a surprisingly small, completely round, and totally deserted cave. But it wasn't truly deserted. All around him, like currents of warm air, were voices, moaning at his ears, getting caught in his fur, his wings. "Fold your wings tight," Frida said, carefully closing the mud panel behind Shade, "and stay still." He barely breathed. Still the voices seemed faint and far away, but he could hear them more clearly now as they swirled about. In the winter of that year, owls took their revenge. 15 newborns died in the nursery. Rebellion crushed after the battle. And he realized they were echoes, bouncing off the walls of the cave, again and again and again. Here's a photo of the cave. "See how smooth the walls are?" Frida whispered. "It took years to hollow them out, polish them. Generations. But it had to be smooth, or else the echoes would snag and fade. Here, they can bounce for centuries. It's not perfect. Sound escapes even through the door they so carefully built, and which I tend to every spring. Sound gets old, loses its power." "What's it for?" Shade asked. "This is the history of the Silverwing colony," explained Frida. "Right here. Every year, one of the elders is appointed to sing the year's stories to the walls, and there they stay." "How do you keep them all straight?" Shade wanted to know, his ears flicking from one eddy of sound to the next. His mind felt cluttered and confused. "It takes a certain talent," said Frida. "Concentration, patience. Few can do it, but I have a feeling about you. Here, Let me help." Shade watched as the old bat swiveled her ears, eyes darting as if in search of insects. "Yes, here it is, the oldest story of all. Catch it now. Concentrate." Shade moved his head up against Frida's, eyes closed, ears pricked high, and suddenly there was a voice inside his head, so clear, so much a part of him, that he jerked back and pinned his ears flat to escape it. "It's an odd feeling, isn't it?" said Frida. "It gets right inside you," he said sheepishly. "It's all right. Try again." He tensed as the sound flowed into him, but this time held on. "Long ago," came the voice. "Millions and millions of years ago, the world was an empty place." It was a female's voice, steady and melodious, and it gave Shade the strangest feeling to think she had spoken these words so long ago, and he was hearing them now, as if for the first time. He listened intently, eyes clamped shut. "There was only Nocturna, the winged spirit, whose wings spanned the entire night sky, and were the night sky, and contained the stars and the moon and the wind. One by one, Nocturna fashioned creatures." The words faded away, and without warning, his mind was filled with pictures. A brilliant silvery world flared up before him, as clear as his own echo vision at night. His eyes popped open in surprise. "What's happening?" "Echo pictures," the elder told him patiently. "We see with echoes, and with practice, it's also possible to sing echo pictures into bats' heads." "It's so real!" exclaimed Shade. "Listen. You'll lose it if you're not careful." He shut his eyes, exhaled slowly, and let the silvery world fill his mind once again. The beginning of the world, and he was there, watching it. He soared past 1,000 different birds, skimmed over 1,000 different beasts on the ground. The earth steamed. He could almost feel the heat, the newness of things. He saw bats, lifting from trees, beating their way through the air. And it was full daylight. The sun burned high in the sky. "We were allowed then," he muttered, incredulous. "We were allowed to see the sun." Then the scene changed abruptly, and he was at the top of a giant tree, and all around him raged a huge battle. Birds dived down at beasts, fighting with their claws and beaks, carrying their smaller victims away and dropping them to their deaths. But the beasts fought back, leaping up and snapping the birds in their jaws, smashing them with taloned claws. The beasts scaled the trees, destroying nests, pouncing on birds in the branches. Shade looked down with horror and saw a wild cat scrambling up his own tree toward him, and he cried out in alarm. But at that moment, he was suddenly higher in the sky, overseeing things from a great, safe distance. "A war!" Shade called out excitedly to Frida, his eyes still closed, still watching. "The great battle of the birds and the beasts," he heard Frida say. "But why?" "No one knows what started it," she replied. He noticed something. "Where are the bats?" "We refused to fight. Each side asked us to join them, but we said no." The silvery images in his head shifted again, and he was flying over a ravaged forest, the trees naked and broken, the earth marked with animal holes and trenches. He knew the battle must have gone on for a long time, years and years. He soared down over a great field and saw beasts and birds gathered there together, holding some kind of important meeting. "The peace treaty," he heard Frida say. She was listening along with him. The bats were there too, and all the other creatures seemed angry with them, shouting and pointing. A great owl spread its wings in judgment, and a huge wolf threw back its head and howled. The bats flew, spiraling up into the air, spreading across the sky. And suddenly, it was night. "What happened?" Shade cried. "The beasts blamed us for losing the battle. The birds branded us cowards for refusing to fight. Listen." The voice that Shade heard at the beginning came back into his head now. "For millions of years we have lived in the dark. The sunlight hurts our eyes now. The winged spirit Nocturna was angry with the other creatures for banishing us. Though she could not undo what had been done, she gave us new gifts to help us survive. She darkened our fur, so we might blend in with the night. She gave us the echo vision, so we could hunt in the dark. But the greatest gift she gave us was the promise. There was a brief silence, and then, long ago, millions and millions of years ago, the world was an empty place. The message had come full circle, repeating itself, and Shade shifted his head out of the echo stream. He felt as if he'd been away for a long time. He turned to Frida. He'd heard of Nocturna before, every newborn had, the mysterious winged spirit who made everything. But he'd heard so many new things and was so knotted up inside with emotion, he scarcely knew where to begin. "We didn't do anything," he exclaimed. He'd expected something terrible, some crime that would make him shudder and feel ashamed of his ancestors. "They banished us just because we didn't take sides in the war." "To the birds and beasts, we were cowards and traitors," said Frida. "But before then, we really could fly in the day? Is that true? We were free?" "I believe so, yes." "What's the promise?" "That's here too," Frida said, tilting her head around the echo chamber. "Let's see if I can find it. It's one of the oldest here." Shade knew Frida could find it in a second, and that she was trying to teach him how to use the echo chamber. Together they sifted through the eddies of sound, and Shade soon discovered that they were all different. The newer messages were clearer and slightly louder. The older ones had a faint hiss to them, words and pictures occasionally muffled or obscured together. "You're getting close," Frida said. He found one story gusting across the cave's bottom, quite faint. He listened, caught a few words. "Is this it?" Frida cocked her head, squinted, and gave a nod. "Well done." Shade latched onto the echo and let the story fill his head. It was another voice this time, unsteady and old, but filled with a kind of radiant hope. "This is the story of Nocturna's promise. It has been carried from bat to bat for over 1,000,000 years, and I speak it to these walls so that future Silverwing generations will know what has passed and what will come to pass. The promise was made one day long ago." Now Shade was in an ancient forest, peering out over the fields. There were no bats in sight. He was alone in the middle of the day, the sun high in the sky. Suddenly, darkness swept over the earth as if a giant bat were slowly unfurling her wings and blocking out the light. The beasts shrank back in terror. The birds shrieked and fled to the cover of the trees. The sun disappeared. Not disappeared exactly, but to Shade it was as if a huge black eye had opened in front of it. Nocturna's eye. That was the first thought that popped into his head. Only the rim of the sun remained, and he was staring at it. This blazing ring of silver light. So bright that even as a picture in his mind, it made his eyes smart. All at once, bats were streaming from their roosts, and he was among them, an ecstasy of wings. They nodded in the sky, then flew apart, swirling beneath this silver ring. It was the first time in 1,000 years that they had been out in the day. The dark sky began to speak, and Shade felt every inch of his body tingle. He knew without a doubt that this was Nocturna's voice, speaking to the bats long ago. "One day your banishment will end, and the cruel law will be broken. You will no more have to fear the claws of the owls or the jaws of the beasts, and you will be free to return to the light of day once again." The silver ring in the sky slowly faded, and then black silence filled Shade's head. The echo began to repeat, and Shade shrugged it off, turning urgently to Frida. "Will there be another war? Is that what this means?" "Maybe. I don't know," she replied. "When? When will it happen?" The bat elder shook her head. "Maybe not in my lifetime, or yours." She paused. "But I think it will be sooner than that." "How come?" Shade asked, startled. "Because of this," Frida told him, unfolding her wing and revealing the silver band on her forearm. Shade gasped, as if seeing it for the first time. He remembered the image of the echo story, the sun being blotted out by Nocturna's black eye, so that it was only a blazing ring of light, a ring of silver, just like the band on Frida's forearm. "You see it, don't you?" Frida asked. He nodded. "How did you get it?" "The humans gave it to me when I was young. Not much older than you, really. There were a couple of us in the forest one night, and they took hold of us and fastened the bands and let us go. I believe it's a sign, Shade, a sign of the promise to come. I don't know what part the humans will play in it, but I believe they've come to help us in some way. Shade sent a delicate wash of sound over the band and picked out the human markings around the rim. He could only wonder at their strangeness, the curves and sharp edges. He'd seen owl scratching once, and raccoon hieroglyphs, but those were by far the most complicated. May I? He asked. Of course, Frida replied, extending her forearm. Shade touched the band with the tip of his claw. Did the humans give bands to anyone else? Not for a long time, so long I began to wonder if they meant anything at all. But 2 winters ago, yes, they came again, and banded some males. My father, said Shade instinctively. Ariel told you, didn't she? Replied Frida. No. She doesn't talk about him much, said Shade. Frida nodded. We used to tell all the newborns these stories, the ones you've just heard. That was years ago. But most of the elders thought we should stop. It was no use thinking about the promise, they said, something that might never come. That's how Bathsheba thinks. They didn't want any more bloodshed. About 15 years before you were born, a rebellion sprung up, but the bats didn't stand a chance against the owls. They fought anyway. We fought, I should say. You did? Shade said, gazing again at the scars on Frida's body. I was lucky to escape with my life. After that, the elders wanted to just stay in the night and forget they'd ever had the freedom to fly in the day. Most bats think they're right, and I can't fault them for that. It makes sense. But for some bats, they just can't let go of that idea of the sun, of freedom. I'm like that, and your father was too. Mom said he was killed by owls. He flew off somewhere just a few nights before we started our journey back north. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. At least I never heard of it. Maybe he told one of the others. All I know was there was something he wanted to find out, about the bands, about the humans, maybe, and he never did come back. There were a couple others before him who disappeared too. Mom said he was foolish for wanting to see the sun. I know that she never agreed with his views, and she wants to protect you, Shade. She might not have told you the whole truth, but I suspect there's a lot Cassiel never told her either. Try not to be angry with her. We should fight them, Shade said with a cold, sudden fury. How could the other Silverwings be so feeble, letting the owls and the other birds and beasts tell them what to do for millions of years? What right did they have? If all the bats would fight, then we could. But Frida was shaking her head. No, not even your father thought that, Shade. He knew we couldn't win in battle. That was obvious. He thought there was something else coming, something we needed. Shade looked away, ashamed at his outburst. He felt immensely tired, as if he'd lived through all the stories in the echo chamber. Why did you show me this? He asked. What was the point? He wondered. There was nothing he could do to change the past, bring his father back, or even change the future. He was a newborn runt in a Silverwing colony in the middle of nowhere. Frida smiled at him, and he didn't find the deep wrinkles in her face so frightening anymore. You're not like the others, Shade. I see something in you, a kind of brightness I don't want to be smothered. You're curious. You want to know about things. I've been watching you. You're a good listener, too. You'll hear things no one else can, and this is far more important than your size, Shade. Shade flushed at the compliment and only wished he could believe it. He had so many more questions he wanted to ask, but there was a fluttering of wings outside the echo chamber, and Shade heard Mercury's voice. Frida, the messenger said urgently, the owls are coming, and they have fire. That's the end of that chapter. Okay, so one thing that is good to do when we're reading is to kind of think back and summarize what we've just learned. So if we were to summarize the echo chamber chapter, we might say that Frida and Shade went to the echo chamber, where Shade found out that that is where the bat's history is stored, in this perfectly round room where the echoes can just bounce off the walls and they stay in there. He learned that millions of years ago there was a great war between the beasts, the animals, and the birds, and both sides wanted the bats to join them, but the bats refused to fight. So then they were labeled as cowards and traitors, and so they were banished to the nighttime. So before then they were allowed to be out in the day, and now they are not. And there's supposed to be a promise from Nocturna that one day they will get to see the light again. be in the day again. And Frida seems to think that the humans might have something to do with it. So the humans gave her a band on her wing, and some other bats a band. And it happened again a couple years ago. And then when we left off, the messenger, Mercury, was sending the message, the owls are coming and they have fire. So this is a good time to make a prediction. So I want you to predict, make a guess. What do you think is going to happen next? What are the owls doing with fire? And what is going to be the result of that? Let me know.